I am Gopika, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to the Professor K.T. Sebastian's Scholar in Residence program instituted by the family of the late Professor K.T. Sebastian in collaboration with the Department of English, St. Berchmans College, Changanasheri, in memories of the late Professor. Today is the second day of the session, and we have our honorable guest, Professor Akeel Bilgrami, with us. Before we begin the session, we'll have a few moments of silence. Thank you. Today, I'm accompanied by my colleague, Maria. Over to you, Maria.
Here are just a few guidelines that the participants are requested to kindly keep in mind to ensure the smooth functioning of our program. All the questions that are for the question and answer session are to be posted in the chat box, addressing it to everyone. A feedback form will be posted at the end of the session in Zoom. Participants are requested to fill it in accordingly. E-certificates will be issued to those who have attended the 2 days of seminar. Participants are humbly requested not to introduce yourself in the chat box, as this might distract the speaker. These were just a few points to keep in mind. Thank you for listening. Over to you, Gopika.
Thank you, Maria. Here we have our honorable speaker, Professor Akeel Bilgrami, with us. Today's topic is the art and the secular. I hope it will be as amazing as yesterday's session. On behalf of everyone, I extend a warm welcome to you, sir. Over to you, sir. You can take over the session. Thank you.
It's nice to be back. I'd like to talk today about secularism in art is the title, but I was prompted to think about these issues because I was recently asked by Professor Tapati Guha Thakurta, who's a distinguished art historian in India, and others to write about modern Indian art and secularism. And I particularly want to focus at some point on the attack on M.F. Hussain, which, as you know, caused him to exile himself from India to Qatar and to Dubai and London, and he suffered from a sort of crisis of secularism in India. But because of what happened to him, the relation between secularism and modern art became a very central theme for a lot of people concerned about secularism in India. And so I want to look at some of the issues philosophically that arise from that. But before I begin on any of these themes, I want to make a distinction, because I don't think you can understand the subject at all unless you make this distinction. And I want to make it right away at the outset, because I will at some point appeal to it later on. This is a distinction between two terms: secularism and secularization. I think it's very important to distinguish between these two concepts and terms. They are not the same thing by any means. Secularization is a concept that was first theorized explicitly and with some intellectual power and sophistication by the German sociologist Max Weber. And the term, ever since Weber, has come to mean basically a decline in religious belief and a relative decrease in religious practice. So loss of belief in God and the myths of creation, is one aspect of secularization. The increasing rise of agnosticism and atheism as an option, and so loss of religious belief is one aspect. Decrease in religious practice, such as, for instance, dietary practices of pious habits of diet, pious habits of dress, church going, mosque going, synagogue going, and temple going, and so on, decreased. When I was in Paris, one Sunday, I visited a church. There were only 3 people in the heart of Paris, a huge church. Well, that's secularization. So a decrease in practices of church-going, dress, diet, rituals of various kind, that decrease and a relative loss of belief in God and the myths of creation and other doctrinal elements of religion, all that is known as secularization. It's a ideational process, social process of transformation of society with less and less belief and less practice of religion. Secularism is a completely different idea. I mean, it's related, but it is a quite distinct idea. And secularism really has to do with institutions of state and laws and constitutions. And it is the idea that religion should not have any direct influence on the institutions of state and its laws. And it should be moved, religion should be moved to outside the orbit of the institutions and codes of the state. That's a much more specific doctrine. So secularization is loss of belief, decrease in religious practice, etc. Secularism is a political doctrine. It's about the state and its laws and how religion should not have a direct influence and presence in the state and laws. Okay, so that's the difference between secularization and secularism. What exactly then is this idea of, in secularism, I'm going to talk about secularism. What is secularism exactly? How is the state and its laws to be kept insulated from religion? Well, in the history of Western secularism, this idea was very confusingly presented in metaphors like separation of church and state. That's a very confusing metaphor, because you very often in secularism you have, so the metaphor is that there's a wall of separation between the church and the state. And the reason why that's completely confusing, and in fact just wrong, confused, is that very often secularism tries to reform religious laws and practices, religious codes and practices. So for instance, the Hindu Reform Bill reformed Hindu law. So the state and its legislature reformed Hindu law. That was a secularist move. But in order to do that, you have to perforate the wall that's supposed to separate church and state, or religion and state. So it's completely confused. In order to have secularist reform, you have to not be secularist. If secularism is defined as a separation of church and of religion and the state, if the state is reforming religion, there is no separation. It's perforating the separating wall. So the idea that it is a separation, and there's a wall of separation between religion and the state, is completely confused way of elaborating what the idea of secularism is. So here is, I'm going to present to you what secularism means without mentioning this confused metaphor of a wall of separation. And here is a characterization or definition, if you like, of secularism, which I'm going to share with you. So I need to share the screen for a moment. All right, can you see the screen? Yes?
Yeah.
All right, so secularism the definition has 3 clauses. 1, and the Indian Constitution has this. Many other constitutions of liberal democracies have it. The first clause in the definition of secularism is freedom of religion, religious belief and practice. This is sometimes called freedom of worship. So the first one says you can be a Hindu, you can be a Muslim, you can be a Christian, you can be a Jew, you can be a Parsi, etc. Freedom to practice. And the second, a second commitment of secularist constitutions is principles often enshrined in the Constitution as rights that neither mention religion nor mention opposition to religion. So they're complete, they don't mention religion, nor do they mention secularism's opposition to religion. Right? Examples of such principles are freedom of speech, gender equality, etc. Okay, so a state is a secularist state if it has these 2 commitments. First, a commitment to freedom of religion, religious belief and practices. Second, principles that don't mention religion in any way or even opposition to religion. They're just completely innocent of any mention of religion, even as an opposition to it or in favor of it, nothing. Third and final clause of the commitment to secularism is if the exercise of one above clashes with 2 above, then 2 must be given priority over 1. Now, a technical term is lexicographical priority, which I have used in my writing on secularism. But this is just a technical word. It comes from mathematics. It's used in economics. And it's just an academic's jargon. You can forget about it. It really comes from dictionaries. What is the first definition? And the other definitions are trumped by the first definition. So, and then it's used in mathematics in certain ways, it's used in economics in ways, and all that is just, I'm going to remove it. Having said it, well, let me leave it. Okay, so this is secularism. This is the secularism adopted all over in European countries, and it is the secularism adopted in India. There are all sorts of people who say secularism existed in Ashoka's reign, secularism existed in medieval Andalusia. That's just ridiculous. Ashoka's reign may have been a good reign. Medieval Andalusia may have been a good society, but not all good things are the same good thing. And secularism is a very specific thing. It arose in Europe at a very particular time in history, in the modern period, and through colonization, it spread to other parts of the world. And this is what secularism, I say, means. It's the secularism that was adopted in India. You have people like Amartya Sen and Radhakrishnan saying secularism is a neutrality between religions. Absolutely not. Anybody who's read the constituent debates, assembly debates, and looked at the constitution and so on, it's not a neutrality between religions. This is what secularism is. And I have defined it without any mention of a wall of separation or anything like that. The idea is this: if you give people religious belief and practice complete freedom to do it, however, you are also committed to various other things like freedom of speech, gender equality, etc. If the practice of religion and its belief clashes with these these principles mentioned in the second, then the two, i.e. the principles mentioned in the second clause, must be given priority over the first. So here's an example. Salman Rushdie wrote a book trashing the most cherished beliefs of Muslims. Right? Okay. This principle here is a principle of free speech. Now, if there are religious beliefs and practices in Islam which say you must censor blasphemy, and Salman Rushdie is blasphemous, right? That's a commitment of Islamic belief and practice. It clashes with freedom of speech. So, if one says censor the satanic verses, and 2 says there should be no censorship, there should be freedom of speech, then 2 is given priority over 1. And you're not allowed to censor satanic verses. That's a secularist state commitment. Okay? So the idea is you can have as much freedom of religious belief and practice until and unless it clashes with principles that are completely formulated without any mention of religion. So if you have Muslim practices of divorce, alimony, etc., you have Islamic practices of that kind, well, if it clashes with gender equality, two must be placed first. That's it. That's what secularism is. So keep that in mind First commitment of secularism is freedom of religious belief and practice. Second is to certain principles, often described as rights, such as free speech, gender equality, etc. And the third, if you like, this is commitment one, commitment two, and this is a meta commitment. I say meta commitment, all that meta commitment means is it's a commitment about the first two commitments. That's all that meta means. 3 is about 1 and 2. It says if the practices in 1 clash with the commitments in 2, 2 must be placed first. Commitment 1, commitment 2, meta commitment 3. All these together define secularism. All right. So, secularization, as I said, is the loss of, it's a completely different thing. Secularization is nothing to do with, it's not a political doctrine at all. It's the name, secularism is the name of a social process of transformation, social and ideational process, you can see that this is a political doctrine. It's got to do with legislation, constitutions, what the state has powers to do, etc. This is just a description of a change in society and in people's beliefs and practices. Okay? That's the difference between secularism and secularization. Okay, I'm going to now remove the share. How do I remove the share? I've lost the, can somebody who has a tech expert tell me how to remove this?
Jaren sir, can you help him?
I can't figure out how to remove the share.
Jaren sir.
How does one remove share?
It's not there.
So you'll find the stop button at the leftmost corner.
Right, stop share. Okay. All right. So, so now that you've got these two concepts, let me take up the question of art. When Hussein was attacked by Hindutva forces in the country, a lot of people responded, a lot of secularists responded by saying that modern Indian art is, and the whole art world of modern art, including the study of modern including the study of art, which is art history, the academic and study of art, museums, galleries, etc. That whole world, let's call it the art world of modern art. After independence, that art world, it is said, was a secular. Modern art is secular, it was said. And so it was a real question whether the Hindutva attack on M.F. Hussain, what it was doing to the independent nation's commitment to secularism. Well, the question then arises, if one says that modern Indian art is secular in response to these Hindutva attacks, I have not yet defined the term secular. I've defined secularism, I've defined secularization, but I haven't yet said what the word secular means. And everybody says that modern Indian art and the whole art world is secular. Well, what does that mean? What does the word secular mean? Well, one way to think about it is to say that the word secular is much more general than secularism or secularization. The word secular means anything whatsoever which lies outside of the domain of religion. Anything which is in the mundiality of the world at large, outside of the cloister, outside of religion, the domain of religion. That's secular. So, in times past in Europe, I mean, I'll give you some European examples because the concept of the secular first emerged in Europe. So when I say anything whatsoever, see, the word secular is much more general than secularization, as I defined it, or secularism. The word secular, being very general, just means anything you like that isn't part of the religious domain. It's outside of the religious domain. Okay. So a merchant's overcoat compared to a friar's tunic is secular. So, if this is a piece of dress, what the merchant in, say, 18th century England or France, what he wore, the overcoat, is secular. A friar's tunic is part of the religious domain. That's how general the term secular is. Anything at all that isn't part of the religious domain is secular. Okay. But in a way, that's not interesting because it is so general, right? So what people then would presumably, while they're interested in the very idea of the secular, is that it's things outside of the religious domain, but which are not, another way of putting that point, which is more interesting, is that religion doesn't control and determine. So suppose you ask, what makes art? Why do people say modern Indian art is secular? What do they mean by that? Well, what it means is, it's not just that it's outside of the religious domain, but religion does not determine and control the practices of art. That's one element. Religion doesn't control. So when people say modern art is secular, they mean religion doesn't control the practices of art and artists. Doesn't determine what they paint or what they erect as sculptures or buildings or decorations. Another aspect is that art is not practiced in the service of religion. So, early music in Europe, Bach's cantatas, many of Bach's cantatas, not all of them, many of Bach's masses, passions, etc., they were all in the service of religion. As was often said of early music, it was sung for the greater glory of God. So if modern Indian art is secular, it means it's precisely not produced in the service of religion. So religion doesn't control and determine it. It is not done in the service of religion. That's what it means to say modern Indian art is not secular. Okay. Now, once this was made obvious and clear, well, one of the ways in which it was made obvious and clear is that in Nehru's India, I mean, Nehru was a very dominant figure after independence. In Nehruvian India, there was a lot of rhetoric of secularization. We really do not believe, we believe in science, Nehru says. We believe in scientific rationality, he said. And when he said all this, it began to be clear that he was sounding very much, artists, when he said things like this, artists began to, and Hussain was certainly one of them, but a whole range of others, many of them were called progressive artists. They were centered in Bombay, some of them in Delhi. They began to see this as a sanction to think of art in terms of a Nehruvian ideal of a secular India. Take, for instance, another factor in Europe. I'm just giving you examples of what Lukács, the great Marxist literary theorist, but social theorist and political theorist as well, but one of the great literary theorists as well, Lukács once said that the novel is a secular literary form. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, he explicitly said that the novel is a literary form of a world abandoned by God. That was his celebrated, famous phrase. It's a literary form of a world abandoned by God. Well, somebody might be an abidingly religious person in the modern period might be forgiven for thinking that to say that it's a world abandoned by God is really to blame the victim. It's in fact the world which abandoned God, rather than God abandoning the world. But anyway, you get the idea that the novel, why did he say that? Because even though there were a few early novels like The Tale of Genji and maybe even some in the early ancient Near East and so on. By and large, it is said by literary historians that the novel emerged in Europe in the last 3 centuries or so. And so all that was really meant by, I mean, Lukács meant a lot of things by it, but one of the things that is obvious why he was saying it is just chronological. It's a trivial chronological point partly because the novel didn't exist in a time when religion was determining and shaping and influencing greatly a lot of literature and art. If you compare the novel to a lot of painting in the medieval period, or decorative arts in the medieval period, you will notice something obvious, that the novel emerged because, I'm not putting this very clearly, let me say it again. You see, in a way what I'm saying is, it's too innocuous to say the concept of the secular is anything that falls outside of the religious domain. It's too innocuous because you really want to say that it's secular if it's come out from under the shadow of religion. It's not just outside of religion, that's too general, but it's come out from under the shadow of religion. Right? So you might say Oxford University is a secular university, not just because it's outside of the religious domain, but it used to be in the religious domain, and it has come out from under the shadow of that. So today, Oxford University is properly called a secular university, not just because it's outside of the religious domain, but because it used to be in the religious domain, and as a result of secularization, has come out from under the shadow. And if that is right, the novel was never under the shadow of religion. Chronologically, it wasn't. It emerged only in the last 200-300 years. People say Fielding and Richardson are the first novelists. So it never was under the shadow of religion, in the way, say, that Giotto's paintings were. Right? So, so it's not just that the term secular means anything outside the religious domain. It means something that used to be in the religious domain but has come out from under the shadow of it. Then it gets more point. And now you can see why somebody might want to say, in Nehruvian India, secularism, the art is properly called secular because, a lot of art used to be religious in India. And modern art, the art of people like Hussain and Mehta and Bhupen Kakkar and so on, is not like that. Okay, so it's outside of the religious domain, but it has special poignancy and significance to be called secular if it's not merely outside, but it has come out from under the shadow of religion. In the way, say, that Oxford University has, and modern art generally has. Art used to be very much shaped by religion, very much in the service of religion, and it is not so anymore. All right. So that's one way in which you can talk about modern art being secular. It has come out from under the shadow of religion. And now once you say that, there is a great tendency to generate what theorists call binaries or dichotomies. So you have religious versus secular art. You have traditional and modern art. You have elite and popular art. You have metropolitan and vernacular art. You have cosmopolitan and provincial art. And there is no doubt at all that after 1947, modern Indian art, under the influence of Nehru's cosmopolitanism, his internationalism, his commitment to science, his commitment to modernity, to industrial development, metropolitan development, the rise of major metropoles like Bombay, Delhi, etc. All of this naturally had a tremendous influence on how artists in the newly independent country saw themselves. Hussain being one of the absolute in the forefront of it, amongst a handful of others, and influencing the younger generation greatly too. Now, when you see them as being shaped by this kind of Nehruvian set of ideals of modernity, of modernizing India, you can see that they would be very much influenced by Paris and New York and London and other centers of art of that kind, especially Paris and New York. Great influence on modern progressive artists' art independence. And you can see that the influence of Paris and New York was trying to shed all the romanticist moorings in Bengal, of the art of Bengal that was dominant until, in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, around the Tagore family and Shantiniketan and all those romanticist ideas, but very rooted. Hussain and others were bursting out of this into the Nehruvian modernist ideal, thinking of themselves as influenced by Paris and London trend, Paris and New York trends, thinking of themselves as cosmopolitan rather than vernacular, international rather than provincial, and a kind of elite avant-gardism emerged with these. They called themselves progressive, so it was in that sense aspiring to avant-gardism, and so all these dichotomies emerged. We are secular rather than religious. We are modern rather than traditional. We are an avant-garde rather than, popular. We are metropolitan rather than vernacular, cosmopolitan rather than provincial, etc. All these binaries naturally emerged as a result of this. It was like Voltaire's Republic of Letters. It was a republic of Indian art. Right. What defined it? What defined it were museums, galleries, cafes where people sat and talked about it. Voltaire specifically talked of the cafe as part of the Republic of Letters, where ideas got discussed. Right? The salon, the cafe, galleries and museums in the case of, and cities, right? So it was Paris, New York, London, reaching out all the way to Geneva and St. Petersburg. Same with India. You had Bombay, then Delhi, and then you reached out to places like Baroda, which were tremendously caught up with modern progressive art. And artistry departments emerged. The Baroda one with Ghulam Sheikh and Nilima Sheikh and others being very much part of this whole, what I think is properly called the Republic of Art, just like Voltaire's Republic of Letters. It was metropolitan. It had all the cultural surround of the metropole's surround of art was cafes, museums, galleries, conversations in these cafes, artistry departments, academic departments all over the country. All this was part of the art world now, right? Defined by these binaries. We are the avant-garde, it's not popular, etc. Okay, now, of course, when binaries form, there are often reactions to them. And very often, and you found that, so somebody like Ghulam Sheikh openly said, look, what is this? Nehruvian India is quarantining the sacred. That's his phrase. Very fascinating phrase to use. He says it's quarantining the sacred. Nobody is allowed to appeal to it anymore, etc. So we must break it down. So there was a reaction to these binaries. And this next generation of artists, many of them, Ghulam Sheikh was one of them, but K.G. Subramaniam, others also, began to say that this is something we shouldn't allow these binaries to emerge. We can have a non-sectarian commitment to engagement with religion and India's traditional past, etc. And Ghulam Sheikh went on to do these very, very interesting screens and so on, which were, so did many others. And Hussein's Bharat Mata and the Saraswati drawing and so on, which was the casus belli of this whole attack, was very much part of this, saying, look, we can engage with it. It's a non-sectarian engagement with religion. So they were trying to break down the binaries of religion, secular, and so on. Not in the way that Hindutva wanted to do, non-sectarian, but nevertheless, they said, well, what is this? Why are you quarantining the sacred? And this happens all the time. It's in every subject, in every domain of thought and art, etc. This happens. There's an enthusiasm for something, it generates binaries. And then people say, oh no, but wait, these binaries are getting really encrusted into these completely separable dichotomies. This is not right. So then they start breaking down the dichotomies and they start mixing. And this is a natural pattern. You make distinctions, they get encrusted in binaries, you then break down the distinctions and the binaries. Okay? This is, why should art and the art world and art history departments be any exception to this? It's just part of how the human mind has developed in culture in every domain, all through history. And as a result, all sorts of people began to say, well, what is this elite versus popular avant-garde and so on? Maybe the popular is the new avant-garde, etc. Right? Geeta Kapoor and others began to say things like this. And Geeta Kapoor even talked of, ideas, she appealing to some work of mine actually, on enchantment and so on. She began to say, well, Gandhi's anti-modernity may be, a way of developing it. So all these binaries between tradition and modern and so on began to be broken down between elite and popular, etc. All right, now I've given you some of the background by which Hussein's drawings, which caused all the fuss and caused so much trauma that he had to leave. And when Hussein left, so I've given you the background, how artists responded to it, and Hussein too began to say, look, there's nothing wrong in my painting, drawing Saraswati and, appealing to that to in my art, etc. And when that got attacked and he had to leave, all sorts of questions arose of a different kind, and secular now began to mean something completely different when it was applied to art. Now, when people wrote about the secular, a lot of the commentary on Hussein and so on, they said, secular, by secular art world, secular art practices, etc., what we mean is that it's protected from attacks by people who are not acculturated into the art world and its commitments and practices and conventions, etc. These people who are attacking Hussein and attacking our art world, so they don't understand. It's not part of our conventions. They don't understand our conventions. We are secular in the sense that we've got a whole range of commitments, conventions, etc., which this attack doesn't even understand when it attacks us. Right? We are a safe space. We are a protected space, protected by our practices, our conventions, our understanding of the world. So you don't understand what Hussein was up to. When you attack him, you think he was trying to demean Indian religion and its goddesses. Nothing of the kind. You obviously have no idea of our conventions, right? So it became a protected. Secular just meant you don't get our conventions, you don't get our practices. You're unschooled. You can only get it if you. Now, I'm against this way of thinking of the secular when you apply it to art. Because what it does is make modern art into a guild. And I think nothing should ever be a guild. Because it kills creativity. To say, we are special, we have an expertise, you don't get it when you attack us. Well, I think that's wrong. I'm against the Hindutva attack on Hussein as much as anyone, but this response to it, giving this meaning to secular, that it's protected, we've got our own conventions which makes us a secular world, art world, and you guys who are attacking us don't get it, well, that's just to turn yourself into a guild. You've got a distinction between expertise and ignorance. Expertise is not knowledge. Knowledge means anybody can learn it. Anybody on the street can learn it. The masses can gain knowledge. Expertise ceases to be expertise once the masses gain it. That's the whole point of expertise. Expertise is a guild notion. Knowledge is not a guild notion. And I think that you cannot really justify the use of the word secular when applied to art on the art world as protecting it from attacks from the ignorant, because what you're doing is you're equating the intolerance of the Hindutva attack on Hussein with the vulgarity of the Hindutva. And I think that's a very, very invidious move. It's fine to call it intolerant. I think it's wrong to call it vulgar. Because the idea that there's a vulgar who doesn't get it means you're the cognoscente, you alone get it. Well, that's actually going to ruin art, because art is at its most creative when it gets challenges from the outside of its conventions. And meets it. So it's a way of killing the creativity in art to see it as a safe space of that kind. It's to regenerate the wrong binaries. Okay, now I want to move on to I think that's the wrong response to. So what I would prefer to do is to say that one shouldn't try and say that modern art is, Indian art is secular in this sense, which generates a guild mentality around it, closing it from challenges that are vulgar. But rather, what one should do is just to defend Hussain on grounds of secularism. But then there's nothing special about art. Art is just one case of free speech, free expression, etc. You're not singling out art as special. And in fact, it's sort of interesting. The law courts were brought in to discuss the attacks on Hussain, and they all supported Hussain. And both the High Court and the Supreme Court judgments were in favor of Hussain, against the Hindutva. And they basically, it's actually rather interesting. If you look at the quite fascinating ruling by Justice Kaul, the High Court, against Hussain, he pointed out two things. First, he pointed out that, look, there's been a lot of nudity and so on, which is part of the attack on Hussain was that Saraswati was there was a nude Saraswati that he'd drawn. Pointed out Khajuraho and so on. There's a long history of erotic sculpture and obvious response. But the point is that he was making was that art is a tool of expression. That's an expression. That's what his phrase is. Art is a tool of expression. So despite singling out art and talking about Khajuraho, etc., as antecedents to Hussain, he nevertheless said that it is a special case of expression. And that's why I think even Kaul, despite all his disquisition on art and Khajuraho, was basically saying, look, treat this as just a violation of secularism. What is that? There are three principles. The second principle says there should be free expression, free speech and expression. Art is part of free speech and expression. So can't run afoul of this lexicographical ordering conception of secularism that we've adopted. That is, I think, the right way to respond to secularism. And I don't think we should think of art as special or a secular space or anything like that. Now, I want to shift, and I want to close by shifting and making a couple of points. I'm sorry, I've gone on for too long, but let me make two quick points and I'll stop. One of the things, I've just said that it's a case of it's just a special case of free expression, free speech, the plainest of speech to the most sophisticated of art, etc., all fall within the second clause of secularism. That is to be given priority. So even if so you can defend him along these lines. But now you have to admit that in every constitution which has free speech, right, and art, I'm saying, should be treated as a special case of free expression and speech. In every constitution which has it, there are built-in exceptions to it. All laws have built-in exceptions. Right? So homicide laws have built-in exceptions about self-defense. You can't commit homicide, but if it's a real case of self-defense, etc., exceptions are allowed. So all laws have exceptions. And free speech has exceptions. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater as a joke, etc. Right? So free speech has has exceptions. And, those exceptions are differently elaborated. In India and in almost every country, there is free expression is. Exceptions are things like national security. That's a standard way of so shouting fire in a theater is a standard example. The general idea is that you have total freedom of expression unless it causes harm. That's principle of John Stuart Mill's harm principle, that unless it causes harm, if you shout fire in the theater, it'll cause harm. There'll be a stampede and people will get, stamp on each other and kill each other or injure each other. National security means the same thing. You're going to cause a great deal of harm if you reveal state secrets, etc. That kind of exception. Whatever you think of it, it's there. It's part of the built-in exceptions to free speech and free expression. Okay, now, when it comes to religion, the standard harm that is treated as an exception is if you cause offense. And that's what was the main argument against Hussein, that he caused a harm with his paintings. What harm? He deeply offended us. That was the argument. And it is true that free expression is often got exceptions of that kind. You can't blatantly hate speech, etc. You can't offend people. But now that raises a real issue, and that is being offended by art or literature, etc., can be irrational, or it can be pretended. I can pretend to be hurt for all sorts of, sleazy political reasons. I can pretend to be hurt. I mean, look, it happens constantly in the football field. Have you ever seen a football game in the last week? People are just falling over and clutching their bodies, pretending to be hurt, just so as to get the referee to produce a yellow card or whatever, a red card, right? Well, somebody could say, a religious community can pretend to be hurt just to molest poor Hussein or whatever. Right? Or even if it's not a pretense, it could be irrational. Right? I mean, an overly sensitive person, forget about politics and just an overly sensitive person, if it's irrationally feeling offended, you can't blame the person who's made a remark, because some person is so thin-skinned that they're going to feel offended at every little thing. So something needn't be offensive, but can give rise to feeling offended, in which case the feeling offended is irrational. what T.S. Eliot would say, there's no objective correlative for the emotion. Right? When Eliot dismissed a lot of what he called bad poetry, it's sort of ridiculous wielding of the idea in some of his remarks on Shelley are about as obtuse as any remark by any literary critic. But of course, Eliot was a very sound literary critic in many ways. But what was Eliot's point? His theoretical point, however he wielded it, I think he didn't wield it very well, but his theoretical point is perfectly sound, which is an emotion can be irrational unless it's got an objective correlative, right? Unless it's genuinely warranted by the situation, the emotion is irrational. So emotions can be irrational, emotions can be pretended.
Exaggerated.
And so when they're irrational or when they're a pretense, you can't blame the person, Hussein or whoever it might be, right? You have to say it's not just causing offense, it is actually offensive. It is justifiably causing offense. That's the only thing that can be indicted, justifiable accusation of causing offense. And that can only happen if it's not irrational emotion, but justified emotion. All right. Now, that's what was being discussed. And Justice Cowell and the judgments against him said, sorry, this feeling offended by the Hindutva nationalist brigade who attacked Hussein is not justified, given the Saraswati drawing and given the Bharat Mata painting and so on. So they were not offensive, even though offense was taken. So they declared the offense being taken to be kind of political manipulation and so on and so forth. It was a case of pretense. In fact, one should read it as a case of pretense rather than genuinely feeling hurt, I feel. I mean, maybe some Hindus felt genuinely hurt, but it was really more like, it's much more like the case of pretense of the football player who clutches his knee and starts yelling and screaming. Okay. But now I want to make one last point on this. Let's look at the question of the secular from the point of view of how not the law, but how the public court. So, theorists often make a distinction between what the law courts, how the law courts judge somebody, and how the court of public opinion judges somebody. And those are very different things. I've told you how, given secularism, Justice Cowell and others in the High Court and the Supreme Court judged Hussein, and they found him innocent. But it's a very interesting thing that in the court of public opinion, many people didn't agree with Justice Cowell. Maybe you and I did, but most people didn't. Many people didn't. So what happens in the larger judgment of the court of public opinion rather than the constitutional and legal courts? And that's a very interesting phenomenon. Now, legally, you see, legally, it's a very fascinating thing to consider how the idea of crime is understood. in a fascinating book called The Origins of Greek, on the origins of German tragic drama, Trauerspiel, Walter Benjamin, a great Marxist, sort of Marxist and Jewish mystic philosopher, made a very interesting observation about Greek epics, about the heroes in Greek drama and Greek epics. Benjamin said that the heroes of Greek drama and Greek epics have no inner life. It's a very fascinating claim. And I remember when I read it, I immediately saw the point, because I had been studying Greek philosophy and Greek, how the Greeks understood punishment and law and morals. And it was very interesting that in Greece, ancient Greece, Homeric Greece and Periclean Greece and Socrates' Greece, etc., there was criminal law was governed by the idea of strict liability. What is strict liability? Strict liability means if you've done a crime, you're just guilty, no matter what was in your mind. Right? So that's just completely of a piece with Benjamin's claim that Greek heroes in drama and tragedy, in Greek tragedy and Greek epic, have no inner life. Because what they're saying is, so take Oedipus, for instance. Oedipus had sexual relations with Jocasta. Oedipus had sexual relations with his mother. Now, those two statements are the same. And so Oedipus was guilty of having sexual relations with his mother. But in the modern world, we would say, no, he was not guilty. But you can't say he was not guilty unless you go to his inner life. He didn't intend to have sexual relations with his mother. He only intended to have sexual relations with Jocasta. But unless you bring in intention, you cannot but see him as guilty. That's what Benjamin was in a way saying. I mean, I'm connecting Benjamin with Greek criminal law. Right? He was just making a point about Greek. But I'm saying, if you subtract the inner life, if you deny the inner life is relevant, literature, I'm connecting it to the law, then he's going to be guilty. Because even though, if you look at his inner life, he's not guilty because he didn't intend to have sexual relations with his mother. So he didn't in any way violate the taboo. But only if you look at his inner life. But if the inner life is not there, he is guilty. He did have sexual relations with his mother. Only in his inner life did he not. And it's only with Augustine, and later through Henry I's codifications, and then much later with Coke's elaborations of criminal law, that mens rea came into criminal law. You have to say, no, the person has to intend to do wrong. And not only intend, but sometimes it's broadened. So sometimes you needn't intend it, but if you knew it was going to happen, even if you didn't intend it, you can be found guilty. Right? So a lot of collateral damage can can be seen as guilty. So, you can see I didn't intend to bomb the civilians. I was intending to bomb terrorists, but the civilians happened to be there. Well, if you knew that the civilians happened to be there, even if you didn't intend it, you were wrong. So it's not just the inner life of intentions, but the inner life of knowledge that you have, etc. Right? So it broadens out. But anyway, all that has got to do with the inner life. And then criminal law can't be seen as strict liability. So in modern law, tort is distinguished from criminal law. Tort has got strict liability, but criminal law is governed by mens rea. Okay, now what Justice Cowell said was there was no intention on Hussein's part to cause the offense that is being claimed by Hindutva mobs, by the Hindutva people who brought the case to court. So what I want to end with is the idea that if in identity politics, such as Hindutva, Islam, Islamic identity politics, whatever, a public opinion, a court of public opinion is set up, and the inner life of the person involved, Hussein in this case, is irrelevant. It's going back to Greek times, right? The fact is, it's completely irrelevant what he intended, etc. The only thing that's relevant is his identity. He's a Muslim. He attacked Hindu. He painted a nude Hindu goddess. He's guilty. What he intended, his inner life, is irrelevant. All that's relevant is his objective identity. He is a Muslim. He painted a Hindu goddess. So it's really a reactionary going back to a time of strict liability given by one's identities. The identity of a son, even though he didn't know he was the son. His inner life, he was the son of Yocasta, but he didn't know. His inner life didn't know. It's just an objective fact. All right, there's an objective fact. He's a Muslim, he must be guilty if he paints a nude. So what's happening with the public, the court of public opinion in identity politics is inner life is irrelevant. Back to strict liability. And that's the difference between Justice Cowell's judgment, that it is, Justice Cowell was looking at a whole development of the idea of crime and criminal law that comes from Augustine's idea of the mind and confessions and so on, to all the stuff on self-fashioning in the Renaissance and so on, where the inner life begins to be central to understanding crime and punishment, guilt and shame and things like that. And all that development of late medievalism and modernity, etc., but not even late, Augustine wasn't that late, all of that is put aside, and it's a reactionary going back to strict liability ideas of crime in the court of public opinion. And that's a big difference between the Constitution and popular judgment, especially in identity politics. Okay, I'm so sorry to have gone on for so long. That's where I'll stop.
Sir, shall we begin the Q&A session?
Yes, I'll take questions by all means. Yeah.
Okay. Now it is time to move on to the Q&A. Myself and Gobika would be reading out the questions simultaneously. So in case you are unable to hear us due to any sort of technical issue or lack of clarity, do let us know. We would repeat the question. Over to you, Gobika.
Okay, sir. The The first question is by Mano John Joss. The question is, while there can be seen a decline of religious practice in the West, the migration of Westerners to Eastern countries such as India and China searching for an ascetic life or seeking for truth. With that in mind, is secularization truly secularism, or is it just a decline in Christianity in the modern world? If it is so, isn't secularism truly a myth? Sir?
Wait, can I just look at the question? I'm afraid my speakers here are distorting you so badly that, who's this question? Who's asked this question?
This question is from wait, sir. Let me check. Mr. Joe. First question, sir. The first question, Mano John Joe, sir. The first question, sir.
What's the name of the person?
Mano John Joe, I think.
I know. Let me find it. Not Manohar John. Manohar John. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
While there can be seen a decline of religious practice in the West, the migration of Westerners to Eastern countries such as well, you see, is secularization truly secularism? Well, my whole point was that it is not secularism. Secularization is not secularism for the simple reason, well, here's an example. The United States is completely secularist, but it's not a very secularized country, especially the heartland of the United States. There's a great increase in religious belief. There's an increase in church going. The mega churches have thousands of people every Sunday compared to Paris or London or Berlin. But the United States is an impeccably secularist country. The same person can be non-secularized and completely secularist. My mother was a believer who prayed. She was not secularized, but she was secularist. She accepted all of the Nehruvian commitments to secularism. No evidence that she was against it, but she was not secularized. You can be a pious person and pray and so on and be completely committed to Nehru's India. Nehru's constitutional, political commitments. So I'm precisely saying it isn't the case, that there are many, many cases. Now, it is true that people came to places like India and China. China is a particularly interesting case because there, the missions became very much more entrenched in China than the evangelists. I mean, the evangelists had their effects here, and some of it was good, some of it was bad in India, but some of it was quite important and good in many ways. Some of its effects on caste, for instance, and so on. But in China, it is a very interesting case because I think that it built real bonds between China and almost romantic bonds between China. In fact, I don't think you can explain the euphoria around the rapprochement between Nixon and Vice China without understanding a long history of the missions there, which made the Chinese people in the United States, which is part of the bonds between the Chinese people and the United States. And you know, when I was a teenager growing up in Bombay, I, in my late teens, read a lot on China because I was quite committed to left-wing radicalism, and all the best work was done. The best things I read on China were by the missionaries, people like Jack Belden and the great Canadian missionary Dr. Norman Bethune. In that wonderful book, The Scalpel, the Sword, and Belden's book, China Shakes the World. I mean, these books really taught me a lot about China, including Mass China. And I think that is absolutely true, that a great deal of these missionary migrations were not just seeking different ascetic religious practices, but also seeking to present their own religious points of view. There was a lot of mixture of that kind. But none of that undermines the distinction that I insist on making, which the question seems to have missed, which is that these are just two different concepts. Now, what is true is that sometimes the state can not just be secularist, but can enforce secularization. Right? So communist Turkey did that. It didn't just have constitutions and codes with the lexicographical ordering of secularism that I gave, but it made people give up a certain script. It made people stop going to mosques and so on and so forth. So that's state-enforced secularization. So I presented secularization as a social transformation of loss of belief and so on, but the state can enforce it too. And that happened in Ataturk's Turkey. And it happens it happened in Algeria, and it happened in Mubarak's Egypt. And so that's different from secularism, a state-enforced secularization. And French laïcité is borderline state-enforced secularization. It's a complicated business. I'm not going to get into that. Yeah, what's the next question?
Sir, the second question is from Umar Nasiruddin, I think. Where would you put dissimulation? Because in art, the secular sometimes masquerades as sacred and vice versa. The religious tries to pass itself off as secular, which occurs as strategy as well as aspiration.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by the religious passing itself off as secular. Do you mean Hindutva religion or? Secular sometimes masquerades as sacred. What is an example of that? Is this person still around? You can't raise a question and then bolt. Just move on to the next question. Well, I'm going to...
Sir, here is the next question.
I'm going to look at Piyush Rawal's question. Let me read it out. Do you mean to say that secularism would end the persecution of artists? Art and artists were and are persecuted in all areas, in all types of societies, ancient, modern, communist, fascist. That's a good point. Look, artists can be persecuted by many people other than religion. I mean, art is attacked, the art world is attacked in all sorts of ways that have nothing to do with religion. I mean, just look at the commodification of art. That doesn't come from religion, it comes from capitalism. That is an absolutely brazen attack on the integrity of art, to commodify every little thing. And for anybody who wants to look at tremendously insightful, I mean, a lot of it is, I don't agree with a lot of it, but a lot of it is very insightful and very interesting. Take a look at Frederick Jameson's book, Postmodernism and the Culture of Late Capitalism. I think that's the title, something like that. I mean, it shows you how capitalism has completely debased the literary and art worlds. And I mean, just look at these idiotic prizes like the Booker Prize and, for that matter, the Nobel Prize. It's just a total debasement of literary talent. So you overnight create these half dozen celebrities over a decade, right? And great, wonderful artists are just ignored. They can hardly sell 20 books. And agents can sell a telephone directory to millions of people if they really set their minds to it. You know, it's just, so there's a total commodification of these things, and the art world is very much prey to that. Lots of art historians have written about it. That's an attack on the art world, and it's got nothing to do with religion. So the art world is attacked from all directions in many ways, but the Constitution has no protection. The reason why secularism was the topic of my thing is that you have the Constitution rules out the Hindutva attacks on secularism, on Hussain, but it doesn't. The Constitution has absolutely nothing in it that can stop the commodification of the art world. Nothing. You might say that's a total shortcoming of modern liberal democratic polities. Sure, you can say that. But we haven't found a way of, within liberal democracy, preventing that kind of attack on the art world. We have nothing, absolutely nothing. But we have a way of protecting Hindutva-style attacks on Hussain. That's in the Constitution. And it's an interesting point that the definition I gave of secularism is not restricted to liberal secularism. If you look at clause 2, where I mentioned free speech, suppose you put in economic equality instead of free speech. Remove free speech. Well, you've got the Soviet Union. Right? The Soviet Union didn't have free speech as a commitment as an example of commitment 2, right? In the threefold definition I gave. Proposition 2 in the 3 propositions I gave defining secularism mentioned various principles. Well, free speech was not a principle that was a part of the Soviet Union's constitution, but a commitment to state-enforced efforts at equality was there. And if religious practices went against it, then it would have a lexicographical ordering prior to the religious practices. So the definition I gave, the examples I gave happen to be examples of liberal societies, free speech, but it's a perfectly general definition. And if by changing the examples in 2, you could include non-liberal secularisms like the Soviet Union. Okay, the next question. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, Peter Handke, in A Sorrow Beyond Dreams, talk about what makes a person join the totalitarian force, which can be summed up in gross simplification to a sense of belonging. The ideas of fitting in a movement, gratify the space that matters. Well, it's an interesting, let me just think about this for a second. Well, you know, it's a lot of the there is no doubt that there is an elite element in the rise of now, this is a very difficult and interesting question. It's not very clearly formulated, but if you, if I think about it for a moment, you see, who's this person? Akeel. The person is asking whether secularism is an elite emergence through a bourgeois elite. And I don't think that's exactly right, though I can see why you might say that. If you look at the British labor movement, it started in the late 19th century through British nonconformism, which was a sort of incipient secular trend. I mean, it started with Methodism, but it's part of the nonconformist. And labor politics emerged out of a kind of increasingly secularized Christianity, unorthodox, heterodox Christianity, nonconformism as they called it. And a great deal of the labor movement was the initial thrust of secularism in Europe. And part of the reason why there are only 3 people who go to a church on, on a Sunday in Paris is because for 100 years, I mean, it's not there anymore, but at least for 100 years, from the late 19th century to the late 20th century, a lot of secularism depended on a secularized society that came from trade unions and a labor movement. You see, people went to union meetings 3 times a week, working people. And that gave them a sense of belonging and solidarity, etc., which in the heartland of America only now is given by the church. So in Europe, union halls replaced the pulpit and the church as places for community and solidarity, human belonging. I mean, human beings have a deep need for belonging, which is wider than the family. If the family was sufficient, there would be no identity politics. The family is clearly insufficient. We hanker for a more public sense of belonging than just the family. And the church provided it for centuries, but unions provided it for working people. And that's very much part of the emergence of a secularized society and a secularist polity in Europe. And so in that sense, it's not elitist. Though you might say in India, it is very much a metropolitan middle class emergence that Nehru was tapping. Okay, I think I've gone on for very long, but let's take one more question. All right, so I wonder if this is an issue that can be tried, summed up, and dismissed within the ambit of aesthetic paradigm or cultural parameters. I don't know. It's just a fancy words without any meaning. Hasn't the whole history of mutual distrust, right from the run-up to the national independence, okay, through partition, through the Nehruvian predilection for secularization? Well, look, who's this person Govind? I don't believe that I've always made a distinction, and I think this distinction is being muddied here in this question. There is a distinction between antecedents and roots, which I keep making almost at every opportunity I can. And I don't believe that the distrust, say, between the Mahasamite element in the Congress and the Nehruvian element in the Congress during the freedom movement is what gave rise to the partition, or is the roots of Hindutva today. I don't think that's true at all. I think the roots of Hindutva today, people like this discussing Prime Minister and Home Minister, the roots of these people lie in the 1980s. They don't lie in the Mahasamite of the 20s. So, no, I don't agree that this has been the roots of this go all the way back to the decades of the early freedom movement. I don't think that's right. You've got to make a distinction between roots and antecedents. There were antecedents to Modi in Savarkar and the Mahasamites and so on, but they were not the roots. The roots were really laid in the 1980s. I mean, for something to be a root, you've got to show that there's a causal organic path from the root to the flower. So if the flower is this, Modi and Amit Shah and so on, the idea that there's a causal path from, say, the 1920s Mahasamite element in the Congress to them, who's shown that? Nobody's shown that. But you can show developments in the 80s by which the Jansangh morphed into the much more powerful BJP. That's where the roots were laid. They were laid as a reaction to Mandal and all sorts of things. There's a completely different set of issues. So this is all very general hand-waving idea that, oh, it must have started from the 20s and so on. There's no evidence of it. You can't just say things. You've got to have historical evidence to show the causal pathway. And there is nobody has shown that. Listen, I'm sort of flagging now. I'm going to just stop. I've talked too much. And I've enjoyed this very much. And I want to record again my respect and memory of Professor Sebastian. I'm very glad to have been asked, and I enjoyed talking to all of you. I'm going to sign off now.
Okay, thank you so much, sir.
Very welcome.
It was an amazing session for us. Now we'll conclude the session, and I invite Professor Nitin Varghese, sir, to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Hello.
Yes.
Good evening to all. Respected Professor Akeel Bilgrami, PJ Thomas, Head Department of English, Dr. Sabu Joseph, Convener, Professor K.T. Sebastian, Scholar in Residence Program, Dr. Sojan K. Sebastian, dear teachers and participants. It seems to be a great honor to propose the vote of thanks to all who have helped us in making this Scholar in Residence Program a success. I express my deep gratitude to Professor Akeel Bilgrami, Sydney Morgan Lesser Professor of Philosophy, Columbia University, New York, for accepting our invitation and be a part of the Professor K.T. Sebastian Scholar in Residence Program 2020. We are extremely grateful to you, sir, for your stimulating and thought-provoking lectures in this program. On behalf of all, I extend my gratitude to you, sir.
Thanks.
I-
Thanks very much.
I also wish to express my gratitude to Dr. Jacob Matthew M, Principal, Dr. Benny Matthew, Father Reggie Kurian, Dr. Josh George, Vice Principals, for your valuable and painstaking guidance in all our activities. Thank you, dear sirs and fathers. I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Dr. Sojan K. Sebastian and other family members of late Professor K.T. Sebastian. Without their generous financial support, it won't be possible to organize this esteemed program. So it is with a privileged heart I thank Dr. Sojan K. Sebastian and other family members of late Professor K.T. Sebastian for your presence and your unfailing support. Yes, I take this opportunity to express my gratitude and thanks to Professor P.J. Thomas, Head Department of English, and Dr. Sabu Joseph, convener of this program, for your support and encouragement. I acknowledge the unwavering support received from Father Jose Jacob, Mr. Anish K. Joseph, Mr. Jeremy B. Sebastian, and Mr. Ramal Thomas. I'm short of words for their involvement and providing us with all possible logistic support towards organizing this event. I extend my sincere gratitude to the student volunteers, Selin, Hadia, Gopika, Maria, Dan and Nina, Prinu of BTV, Tojo of Netareva YouTube channel, who ran around doing a lot of things. Thank you so much. Also, my thanks to all the people who have directly and indirectly helped us to make this event successful. Finally, the wonderful participants who have turned up, not only from our college, also from colleges across Kerala and outside Kerala. Thank you so much for your cooperation. And we look forward to your participation in the forthcoming academic activities of the department. At the end, I would like to express our gratitude to all of you once again for your participation and cooperation. Thank you all. Goodbye.